Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm Rob Schofield at NC Policy Watch. This is the latest of our crucial conversation luncheons, which have been on a variety of subjects. We had one just last week on the usefulness of business incentives. I want to introduce quickly my colleagues at NC Policy Watch. Chris Fitzsimon, the director of NC Policy Watch. We've got Ricky Lung, who's our new media director over here on the camera, broadcasting to millions out there, the TV audience. Clayton Hinkle, who is our communications coordinator, is on the way. And Sarah Vasca, our investigative reporter, is in the back room. We have a lot of fellow Justice Center folks here. And I also want to call attention, where's State Representative Angela Bryant? She stepped out for a minute. Well, applaud for her when she walks back. I was going to say that I really appreciate you all coming out here today because, of course, I recognize that we're competing with Art Pope. Art Pope is speaking at the Civitas luncheon today. I know you were disappointed. I actually do think we've lost some people to a protest, maybe, but in any event, thanks for coming out. It's also, I suppose, the topic for today is workers' rights and more specifically wage theft. And I think that in the fact that it's really sort of fitting and appropriate because, right now in Wake County we're having a bit of a controversy over a very high-profile public figure who's about to stop working and still get paid $250,000. It's sort of the inverse kind of wage theft, if you think about it that way. But in any event, we're delighted you could be with us today. Our main speaker, of course, is Kim Bobo, who is the director of the national advocacy group Interfaith Worker Justice. We'll also have Sabine Schoenbach from the Justice Center, who has a new report to talk about some of the more detailed specifics of wage theft. And then we've actually done a new one of our Carolina Issues polls on the question. It's hot off the presses this morning that we'll spend a few minutes going over those poll results after our first two speakers. But I'm going to ask Carol Brook, who's the director of the Workers' Rights Project at the NC Justice Center, to come in and introduce Kim. I'm sorry I didn't flip this microphone.
That's all right. Okay. Great. Well, I'm really glad to see everybody here today, and especially glad to have Kim Bobo here from Interfaith Worker Justice. Kim is the founder and executive director of Interfaith Worker Justice, which connects churches and workers together to support worker struggles across the country. They support union struggles and organizing fights, and they've created multiple worker centers around the country, including one here in Morganton, North Carolina, which has been active for many years in the case farm poultry worker struggles. Kim has become the national spokesperson on wage theft. Her 2009 book, Wage Theft in America, Why Millions of Working Americans Are Not Getting Paid and What We Can Do About It, changed non-payment of wages from a silent problem, an epidemic really, across the country, to being the subject of campaigns, worker-based campaigns nationwide, most of which IWJ has actively participated in and supported. At the Justice Center, speaking personally about our work, we get calls every week from workers who've not been paid for the work that they do. Workers who have either not been paid at all, who have been paid a piece rate where their wages don't add up to minimum wage, workers who are having illegal deductions made from their wages for things like personal protective gear, uniforms. We've even had workers who had to help pay through a mandatory deduction for their boss's birthday party. So you just never know what kinds of wage theft is going on out there until you start answering these calls. It's alive and well in North Carolina, and we are delighted to have Kim here to talk to us about what it is and what we can do about it. Please join me in welcoming Kim Bobo.
Here we go. All right, wage theft in America. As Carol shared, I do want to talk today about what is wage theft, how does it happen, what are the sectors that it's prevalent in, why does it happen, and really also what can we do about it. So what is wage theft? It's the illegal underpayment or non-payment of workers' wages. Now, occasionally people want to expand it and make every bad thing that happens in the workplace wage theft. I think that's not helpful for us because there's a lot of bad things that happen. But what we're talking about at wage theft is flat out illegal, right? There are laws and people are breaking the law, and I think it's really important that we keep it within that definition. Okay, so how does it happen? It's employers not paying the minimum wage. The largest study that was ever done on this issue of wage theft was done by the National Employment Law Project. And they surveyed 4,300 low-wage workers in 3 cities, Chicago, New York, and LA. So these were workers that make $10 an hour or less, right? So that's what the largest survey has the stats for us. But again, I think we can assume that if things are really bad in New York, which has actually some of the best labor enforcement in the country, that it's probably just as bad in North Carolina. I don't think that's a fair assumption. So again, I think these statistics are fair ones for us to look at. That study showed that 1 out of 4 low-wage workers is not paid the minimum wage. You know, employers don't pay it. It also showed that of people who work overtime, now a lot of workers don't work overtime, but for those who work more than 40 hours a week, 3/4, 76%, aren't paid overtime. And I see this all the time, right? People will say, well, look, I know that my employer is supposed to pay overtime, but my boss says he doesn't pay it. Just doesn't pay it. Or, you know, well, I know I should get overtime, but at least I have a job, right? I mean, this overtime problem is a problem not just for low-wage workers, but also for middle-income workers, many of whom ought to be covered by overtime laws, but their employers just tell them they're not, even though, again, legally they are. You know, classic, last week I was riding in the car with a young woman. She's a senior in college, you know, well-educated on some level, and she had worked for a restaurant, and she'd started out as a trial period as a manager, and for 20 hours a week she made $275 a week. Well, that's okay, right? Then he said, you're doing a great job, I'd like you to become a full-time manager. And so then she started working 70 to 80 hours a week, but her salary never changed. Her boss kept saying, well, you know, we'll work it out, right? We'll figure out what the wage should be, and then I'll pay you all the back wages. 5.5 months later, she's like, you know, I gotta have this money. I'm losing my apartment, and the boss said, you know what? I really don't think you're worth more than $275. I'm not paying you, you're laid off. 5.5 months she worked, clearly below minimum wage, below overtime, no overtime. In Chicago, we have a worker center affiliated with us. That's the organization's called Arise Chicago. It's our local affiliate. Last week they came out with a study of car wash workers. They had surveyed 1/3 of the workers in the city of Chicago who work in the car wash industry. 80% were not paid minimum wage, 98% weren't paid overtime, right? Just crazy stuff, right? And some of the workers actually had to pay to be at the job, right? There's a car wash right near my office in Chicago where workers pay $12 an hour to have the privilege to be there to work for tips, right? $12 to pay to work there, crazy. Then there's shaving of hours, right? This is when employers require or end up having workers work 45, 50 hours a week, and then they kind of shave off the hours and just pay them for 40. This happens at a small scale, at a large scale. I was talking to a woman who worked at a pool the other day, you know, summer recreation job. And they were very clear, you can't work more than 40 hours a week because, you know, we don't want to have to pay overtime, right? They're very clear about that. But when somebody wouldn't show up for a shift, they would ask them to work an extra shift and not write it down because, again, you can't work more than 40 hours. Or I was talking to a woman who works in a fairly middle income kind of place. She makes a decent enough salary, but again, she's told you can't work more than 40 hours a week. But if you don't get your job done, you'll lose your job. And it takes them 45 to 50 hours a week to actually get the job done. And so nobody puts down anything more than 40 because they all want to keep their job. Or then, of course, the quintessential case is Walmart, where the managers were under such pressure from headquarters to keep payroll costs down, that they literally went into the time records and shaved off the hours. People would put in 45 hours and then just shave it right off and say they worked 40 hours. They settled 65 class action lawsuits around this issue, primarily of shaving hours or not paying people for all their hours. So it is not just a small problem from companies that don't understand the law, it's the nation's largest employer. Then there is payroll fraud. This is when employers lie about actually having workers, having employees, and they call them independent contractors. That's right. And if you call somebody, if you lie about your workers, your employees actually being independent contractors, then you're going to cheat them of what? Benefits. Well, now benefits, there's no law about benefits. So in fact, let's, again, this is what's not right, and now they will cheat you of that. That's not illegal, right? Overtime. That's right. So you're not going to get overtime. You're not going to get workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, the employer side of payroll taxes. So they are not only going to cheat the workers, but they are going to place good businesses who pay workers as employees at a competitive disadvantage, right? Because they're going to save 30% on their payroll costs by lying, where a good business is going to be paying these things. And they're going to cheat the public coffers because they're not paying into our taxes, which is why we are seeing so many states convene task forces on this issue, because it is cheating not only workers and good businesses, but it's cheating the public as well. And, employers sometimes will say, oh, well, it's so confusing, these tests around it. It is not confusing. That is not true. A friend of mine who runs the Wage and Hour division for the Department of Labor, Nancy Lepping, she said, look, if you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror and you say, I'm running my own business, you're an independent contractor. If you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror and you say, I'm going to work for somebody, you're an employee, right? Again, there's the ABC test and there's the 10-point test and there's blah, 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 blah. But it really is the look in the mirror test, right? Who are you working for? And what she was describing, which is so true, it's like employers act like they can just call people something and it's what it is, right? Like there's, you can be an employee, you can be an independent contractor, or you can be something else that they make up, right? There's really two options. You either run an independent business or you're an employee. And this is, in fact, one of the areas where the most wages are stolen. Hi, Mike. Glad you're here. In the country. And it is a huge crisis, as you all saw in the article recently. Then there is tip stealing, right? This is when workers don't get paid their tips. 10% of tipped workers, again, this big study that I was talking to you about, 10% of tipped workers don't get their tips. I went to my favorite restaurant in Chicago, a place called Tank Noodle. I go to put my tip on the credit card, and I say to the waitress, if I put it on the credit card, will you get it? And she said, no. No, she won't get it. Okay. So then I order food for our staff luncheon from Viceroy, my favorite Indian restaurant. If I'm ordering it, it might be my favorite food, right? And so, they come, I pay for it with a credit card, and I give the guy a tip for the food. And he doesn't know anything about what I do. He says to me, oh, I'm so glad you paid me in cash because I never get the tips if they're on the credit card. Really, it's just this tip stealing is widespread, so you must always ask. Then there's the weird deductions. I love Carol saying, the employer that deducts for his birthday party, right? Really? I mean, there were some workers in New York at one of the restaurants, and if they slammed the door too loudly, they would deduct $5 from their paychecks, right? Because you're slamming the door, right? Or there's a poultry company on the eastern shore of Maryland, where we got looking at these very odd pay stubs, right? And come to find out, the employer lobbying group they were paying for it by deducting from workers' paychecks. Really? It's like, again, the deductions for stuff are just over the top and really odd, and often workers don't even know what they are. And then there's the weird kickback schemes. So this happens particularly on prevailing wage contracts, right? So on government contracts, prevailing wage laws were put in place in the 1930s so that when public dollars were used, that those public dollars wouldn't undermine sort of the standard wages in the community, referred to as Davis-Bacon is the big one for construction. So what employers, unethical employers, are doing is they bid on the contract. Of course I'll pay prevailing wage because you can't get the contract if you don't bid that. Then they write out the checks that show them paying the prevailing wage. Then they literally drive them to the check cashing place, make them go in and give them half the money back, right? Standard in lots of cities right now, these weird kickback schemes. We have a worker center in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the employer had gotten caught stealing wages, right? Not paying overtime, and had settled with all the workers. And then they came up with a new scheme, right? Okay, so we're going to pay you, and we'll give you paychecks that show that you've got it, but then you have to give us cash every week after we give you your paychecks. And so, we videotaped it, right, and put it on the news, and, that stopped that. But, again, just these weird kickback schemes. Okay, so what sectors is this prevalent in? So restaurants are notorious. Every time there's research on restaurants, they find not only the problems in the front of the house with the folks with their tips, but it's the back of the house where the cooks and the dishwashers are called independent contractors, or they're just paid these flat salaries of $200 and $300 a week, and they work 60, 70 hours a week. It is notorious in the restaurant industry. It is not just the small little places, it's some of the big places as well. This woman that I was telling you about that I just talked with last week, she worked for a restaurant in Chicago called The Sopranos. It's a big la-di-da restaurant, right downtown. Again, it's not just the small mom and pops. Residential construction, probably one of the worst industries in the country. Now, commercial construction historically has not been as bad as residential because commercial tends to be union, right? Tends to be the bigger firms, has tended to be, probably not in North Carolina, but in most places, has tended to be union, and thus it's frankly much better. But residential construction, it is absolutely the wild, wild west out there. A few years ago, there's one of the nation's largest home builders, a company called Pulte Homes. We sent religious delegations out to a number of Pulte Home work sites where they were building homes, right? The whole subdivision is Pulte Homes. We didn't find a single worker who was paid as an employee. Every single worker was paid as an independent contractor. They all worked these 60, 70-hour weeks. You did the math on it. Nobody was getting overtime. Most of them weren't being paid minimum wage. And of course, on top of that, there are just all sorts of weird health and safety violations, right? Because if you act like they're not your employees, why do you care about their health either, right? I mean, the wildest one, I saw these guys, and they would take, like stilts, those things you used to play on as kids. They would take a stilt and then they'd tape another stilt to it and then stand up on top of it so that they wouldn't have to slow down to put scaffolding up to be able to do the drywall in these vaulted ceiling kind of buildings, right? But it was because they were earning so little and the company didn't care about any of those issues. So residential construction is just like bad everywhere. Then there's retail, restaurants, little shops. Again, little retail stores. The big retail chains, not so much inside, right? But the little, small retail stuff, huge problems. They call all the assistant managers all, exempt from overtime, and they don't count the hours, and they ask them to clock in early, and anyway, all this work before they clock in, all that sort of stuff. Janitorial, absolutely horrible unless you happen to be in a union. And janitorial services is where there's a lot of contracting. And so you find not only sort of the small problems, but places like Target, which, you know, I wish everybody says, well, can I shop in Target because I can't go to Walmart? Well, you know, again, Target, I think internally, you don't hear a lot of complaints about their cashiers or whatever. They have a huge problem with these contracted janitorial firms. I've got literally in my closet, a friend of mine from Texas sent me an entire, it's really almost a closet full of affidavits from workers who work for janitorial firms that were contracted with Target. So again, janitorial stuff is horrible. Car wash, again, in Chicago we did the survey, but every survey that's been done in every city in the nation finds the same thing with car wash, as well as sort of the next level up from the car wash industry is you know, like this detailing stuff. Again, I never had it done on my car, but you know, where they like clean it up kind of real good. Anyway, there was this detailing company in Nashville, Tennessee. It had a lot of workers, almost 200 workers in it. And they had this weird thing where when a car drove in to be detailed, then they would clock all the workers in. And then when a car drove off, they would clock them all out. Right, so they would be there, you know, 12, 14 hours a day, but they would pay them for 6 or 8 hours a day, right? Again, apparently that practice is widespread throughout the detailing. Then there's landscaping, right? These little trucks all over with a little, you know, again, every survey that's been done shows 80, 90% of these guys are not being paid according to the law. Or then there's the nail salons. Now, I never go in because I don't like the smell. But I direct a church choir, and they keep giving me coupons for, you know, getting my nails done because they think my bite iron, so they think they're so horrible looking. But you know, not only does it stink, right, in a dangerous way for these workers, but again, across the board, not paid minimum wage, not paid overtime, often called independent contractors. Non-union hotels, notorious for not paying folks. Poultry industry. My favorite story on the poultry industry was a number of years ago. We did, Carol's done a lot of work in poultry as well. We did this campaign to like push the Federal Department of Labor to investigate the poultry industry, right? So they did this, you know, nationwide investigation looking at 51 poultry plants. They found, the first investigation found that 60% of poultry plants were violating the law. Primarily not paying people for donning and doffing, you know, putting on protective gear and taking it off. And so then the DOL decided they would spend 2 years educating the industry about the issues. So, and I thought that was kind of dumb, right? Because, again, I didn't think it was an educational problem. So anyway, so 2 years later, they resurveyed the entire industry. In the resurveying, they found that 100% of poultry plants were violating the law. Yeah, I mean, obviously the education didn't work. The truth is, I don't think things really got worse. I think what happened was the investigators knew what to look for, right? But again, 2 years of education, it wasn't an education problem. It was, you know, intentional behavior by those who run the poultry plants. Recreation, summer pools, all the folks doing, you know, all the camps, usually problems. Fairs, the folks who work in all these little fairs around. You know, we have a workers center in Syracuse, New York. And they got a call from the emergency room at the hospital saying, you know, we think you need to come here and hear these stories. They came to the emergency room. There were all these workers in there, and the main condition was the doctors declared they were all malnourished, right? So they were malnourished. They had tick bites and bed bug bites just up and down their bodies, as well as burns from the cooking that they were doing. They were legal workers. They were here on an H-2B program. They were locked at night into 2 trailers that were just filled with bed bugs and ticks, and they weren't being paid. And so they literally were malnourished, starving to death, cooking food at the New York State Fair, right? Well, so this gets me kind of interested in this fair issue. Well, the workers center, just to tell that story. So they helped them recover. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars in back wages, and there's a trafficking complaint still out there. But then we started looking at fairs, and apparently there's these whole agencies that recruit people to come into fairs, and they not only work most of the state fairs, but they work the church fairs too. Right? So again, there are large sectors in the society where wage theft is just common practice. And it's not really, actually I didn't even talk about farm workers. I just assumed you all know farm work is just like, has never been good, is always bad, it's just outrageous, right? But again, there's huge sectors that are where wage theft is common practice. And these are not sectors somewhere else. They're sectors that you and I relate to on a regular basis. So, why do we have this level of wage theft in the society? Well, first, it's because of greed, right? I mean, this is nothing new, right? It talks in the Bible about greedy employers, right? So I think the issue is, it is greed with inadequate pushback forces against that greed, right? You gotta have forces that push back against it. And I believe that in this economy, it exacerbates wage theft problems. The Federal Department of Labor, in the first 6 months of this year, had more overtime claims filed than it had in the entire year last year. Right? So again, as the bad economy continues, employers who are prone to wage theft, prone to take advantage of people who are vulnerable, feel free to do so in this kind of economic environment, knowing full well that most workers won't want to file complaints because they're afraid. And that's, obviously it's the most true for workers without documentation. But it's really, this problem is not just an immigrant problem. It is an immigrant problem, right? But not just. And it is completely wrong to suggest that this is only an immigrant problem. It's not. It really affects white workers, African American workers, workers across the board. But anybody who feels vulnerable is likely to be a victim of wage theft. So let's look at what some of the pushback forces could be or should be. So unions historically have been a pushback force against wage theft, right? If you had a union in your workplace, you're probably not going to have wage theft because they're going to figure out how to stop it. The problem is, in the nation, we've gone from 30% of workers represented by unions to 10% of workers represented by unions. And what's the number here in North Carolina?
Less than 3%.
So you're in deep doo-doo here on the issue of wage theft, right? You just really don't have that pushback force against wage theft, and it's a problem, right? Which is why every time workers try to organize unions, we need to stand with those workers, right? Because it is an important force against greed in the society. Second pushback force against wage theft ought to be the Federal Department of Labor. Now, the Federal Department of Labor, the leadership in it right now is phenomenal. They are trying all sorts of new things. They are, working really hard on going up the supply chain and hot goods enforcement and, putting out good regulations. They're doing phenomenal work. But there are still, even with the increase in staff, 1,000 investigators to protect 135 million workers in the society, right? One investigator for every 135,000 workers. It's just not enough, right? It is not enough. Under Francis Perkins, when they first started, they regularly investigated, I think it was 1 out of 10 workplaces, where they would literally just show up. They almost never do that now, because they just don't have enough staff to do it. And each time they've come out with new regulations, there's been just unbelievable backlash against the regulations. They defeated the new child labor and agriculture regulations, right? They pulled them back because there was so much pushback against them. One regulation that's likely to come out if the current administration is back in office, one regulation that I think will come out that we will strongly support, and I'd like you to keep your eyes out for, is one called Right to Know. In terms of your paycheck, or it's often called the transparency regulation. It would require that every employer provide a pay stub that explains how their wages are calculated. We believe this would be a huge asset in the fight against wage theft. Because if workers could see they're paid 60 hours straight time and no overtime, or what the weird deductions are, very important. So many workers are either paid in cash or they're paid with checks that don't explain anything, or increasingly, their employers are requiring them to take direct deposit. And they get the direct deposit, again, with no pay stub, and they have no clue, like, well, what am I paid for, what are the deductions? So we believe it would be an important enforcement tool to be able to have a nice, clear pay stub. So federal enforcement is nowhere near where it ought to be. The great leadership trying to do their best, but it's not enough. I would say the same is true here at the state level. You got people like Mike who are really committed to doing a good job, right? I bet, I don't know the investigators, but I bet they really care about these issues. But one, there's not enough of them, and two, the laws aren't quite strong enough, and the penalties aren't strong enough, and they can't collect the monies from workers. So it is a huge problem. I just dropped my glasses under here, excuse me. Okay, there we go. I'm back. What we're seeing around the country is folks trying to figure out, how do we strengthen our state enforcement? How do we give them the leverage, the tools, the resources they need to do the job? Now, I have to tell you, it could be worse. Virginia voted out money for all their Department of Labor, right? So it's like gone. Iowa has one staff person and they haven't filled the position, right? Or, Florida voted out their Department of Labor. So, things could be worse, but frankly, that's not much of a standard. And so, what we're seeing, in New York State, right? They ran an awesome campaign that created a whole lot of new ways to go after employers that are stealing wages. Same thing in Washington State. New effort in Oregon. Laws in New Mexico that did triple damages. They did the only pro-worker piece that passed in Texas last year was a piece on strengthening wage theft in the state. Right? Very conservative state, won a piece on wage theft. And so, the idea that you all have been talking about, and the North Carolina Justice Project Center has been talking about trying to figure out how to strengthen the enforcement in North Carolina, is absolutely the direction to go. And I think, I don't care who you got in the legislature. I understand that it's not the most worker-friendly legislature. You can still win this stuff, right? Because thou shalt not steal, right? This is a very biblical principle. And people get it once you start talking about it. Another pushback force that you have to mobilize to be able to win these local campaigns are the ethical businesses. And I'll have to tell you, more or less, until recently, they had been missing in action on these issues, right? The ethical business groups, to the extent that they exist, have been focused on environmental issues or racial diversity, gender diversity, all of that's good. I'm for all that. But they have religiously avoided talking about wages and benefits. And so I think part of our job is to get them talking about this. Now, if you talk to people on the side, particularly in restaurants, construction, some of these sectors that are just notorious, if you talk to ethical business leaders, they know about these problems. A good friend of mine, Stan Merrick, who's a big construction firm owner in Houston, Texas, very active in the Republican Party, really very active in the Catholic Church. I love this man. He describes wage theft as, it's our dirty little secret. But the problem is, it's not little and it's really not a secret, right? We all know about it in the construction sector, and it is wrong. He's got some, you can get him from my website, actually. He's got some great presentations he's made to business schools about the crisis of wage theft. But we need more Stan Merricks, right? We've got to find them in our community, and if you're going to win a campaign in the state, you're going to have to get them speaking up and really making the leveling and the playing field argument. It is a very significant argument, but it is important for moving our legislature. I'd say the most hopeful new pushback force against the greed of wage theft really have been the worker centers around the country. 10 years ago, there were probably 5 worker centers in the country. Today, there are over more than 200 worker centers in the country. These are very much like the settlement houses, the Jane Addams Hull House of the turn of the century, or they're like the Catholic labor schools from the 30s to the 50s, or the Jewish labor lyceums from that same time period, right? There are historical precedents for these institutions, but they are centers that are kind of drop-in centers for workers who haven't been paid. They do some of the work like your Justice Center does, right, where they do some of the legal advocacy and that. They also help workers file complaints with government agencies. And the Federal Department of Labor, both Wage and Hour and OSHA, have told all the worker centers in the country that they can file third-party complaints on behalf of workers, right? Which is a huge deal. So workers, if they're afraid, don't have to file, and the worker centers can do that. And whenever we find when we find DOL investigators who haven't gotten the message that this can happen, frankly, all we do is we call up to DC and we say, we got an investigator in Tennessee who won't let us file complaints. And, and they give him the message, and, so again, it's really, there's been a real openness to this. But in addition to sort of filing complaints and connecting with lawyers, they also do direct action. And the worker centers around the country have perfected how to do direct action to get workers' money back. And the beauty of direct action, and I'm going to tell you what that is in a minute, but the beauty of it is workers can be involved, those of us in the community can be involved, and you get the money back fast, right? So that's why, often when we meet with workers and they tell these horrible things and you sort of lay out, well, we could file a lawsuit, we could, complain to the State Department of Labor, we could do whatever. And they'll say, well, what's the fastest way I can get my money back? Because they don't want their money 6 months from now. They want their money now so they can pay their rent, right? So in fact, that's why the worker centers have really, a lot of times they don't even do any of the kind of legal stuff. They just go straight to direct action. So direct action, our worker center in Chicago, we got a call from some workers. They came in and they'd been complaining about having to put stale pepperoni on some pizzas for a place called Homemade Pizza. And the employer didn't like them telling him how to run his business, so he fired them on the spot, threw their belongings out in the street, and said, for the trouble you've given me, I'm not going to give you your last paycheck. So they come into the worker center, so they haven't gotten their last paycheck. We start looking at the stuff. Most of them weren't paid the minimum wage. None of them were paid overtime, right? So you have 3 clear violations of the law. So the worker centers almost always try and make sure there's not a mistake. So we call the employer of Homemade Pizza and say, look, got these workers, is this a mistake? And he starts cursing at us. Okay, probably not a mistake. So then the worker center says, okay, there's a bunch of these little outlets all over Chicago. 5 of them, we're going to do actions Tuesday, 6 p.m., show up at one of them. So I show up at the one near my house, 6 p.m. Tuesday night. There's a little group of about 12 of us, a couple workers, and the rest of us just people who want to help. And they decided to send the people with gray hair inside, so I got to go inside. And the younger folks were like outside flyering. They had little flyers that said, don't buy pizza topped with exploitation. So they're flyering outside. I go in with the group inside and asked to speak to the young manager. They're all looking young. And said, would like you to call the owner and tell him that he needs to pay the workers their wages. He said, I don't have the phone number. No problem, I've got it right here. I gave him the cell phone. He calls the guy. He clearly had, within few minutes, get similar calls from 5 different locations around the city. Half hour later, he calls the worker center insisting that he has to meet with us, right? That he wants to meet, immediately. Okay, fine. So a couple of days later, he comes with his lawyer, and the lawyer says, you really do have to pay these workers, right? I mean, it's the law. And so a couple of days later, he pays them, right? Again, he's not a good employer. He's not a nice guy. He didn't have a conversion of his values. But the workers got their money right away, which is why folks do the direct action. And again, they get it right away. But workers love the fact that they can stand up to their boss and get their money back. There's just an empowering process on it all. That for folks who've often been abused in the workplace is a really healthy thing. And then for people like us who want to help, having a concrete way that we can actually, I help these workers get money back. It's a good thing, right? So again, I don't think direct action substitutes for good, strong state and federal enforcement or, frankly, good class action lawsuits that can change a whole sector. But it is an important feature that the worker centers bring to the table. Okay, so what can we do to help? I have 5 things you can do individually and 5 things we can do collectively. So individually, pay your tips in cash. If you don't know any better, either ask the person if you're going to get this, and if not, just pay it in cash. Secondly, anytime your congregation, your synagogue, your church, your school, your business is going to contract work, you have to ask how workers are paid. And if the contractor says, oh, I pay them all as 1099s, not, right? You gotta ask, right? Because there's such a problem on these contracted services committing payroll fraud. It's a huge problem. Third, if you hear about somebody not getting paid, don't just say, what a sad thing. Push them to fight back against it, because if they steal from your sister, your daughter, your son, they're going to steal from somebody else. And it's really important that we help people to stand up against it and go with them. Now again, people are often afraid, but if they leave the job, then go right then and try and get the money back. Help them file a complaint, right? It is not a good thing to let any of this stuff go. 4, I think, there's a lot of problems that just talking about them doesn't help. I actually think on this one, talking is at least a little bit of a help. Because people think, almost everybody has some experience with wage theft, right? They know somebody who's not been paid or didn't get their last paycheck or whatever, but they think it's an isolated problem, right? An individual bad apple, as opposed to sort of a national epidemic of wage theft. And so I think helping people understand that this isn't an isolated problem, this is in fact an epidemic, reframes how we're going to deal with the solutions, right? It's not just getting the one person to do the right thing. And finally, on an individual level, I hope you will connect with Interfaith Worker Justice. We've got a mailing list. I hope you'll give me your email and your name and let me get you on my mailing list. By the way, I will ask you for money. That's part of what I do. In fact, Sandy said, you asked me way too many times for money. Okay, but I might ask way too many times, but still, I'm going to tell you, when these new regs come out in Congress, I'm going to tell you what you need to do to offer comment on those regs. And when the home care regs came out, there were 6,000 comments of them. 1,500 of them were generated by IWJ, right? And you won't be involved. If you just read the local newspaper, you won't know. So I ask you to get on our mailing list so you can connect and work with us on that. And if you want to support us along the way, that would be good too. Now, collectively, how can we work on this? We do need to strengthen the Federal Department of Labor. So when those transparency regs come out, I hope all your organizations will publicly support them as well as generate comments. We've got to strengthen the Federal Department of Labor. Secondly, we've got to strengthen the State Department of Labor. We've got to be working with those in leadership to figure out what tools they need. Now, they may not advocate with you, but they will answer your question about what will work and what will not. And so I think that North Carolina Justice Center's effort on this is really significant, and we've all got to figure out how to support that. Lots of states are moving on this. Thirdly, there's a new effort to do a day labor center in Carborough. But aside from that, really the only other worker center is the one in Morganton, and there was one for a while connected to the Smithfield campaign. But trying to figure out, is there a way to create, support, and generate more worker centers in North Carolina? Again, it's not the whole solution, but it's an important piece to getting these issues on the radar. I think every time you can survey workers and put the word out about wage theft is a good thing. I understand there's some students in one of the universities nearby who are doing a survey of a bunch of restaurants. Absolutely do that. Or, if you're in a small town, survey, have somebody survey every restaurant and give little awards for the good ones and, publicize the bad ones, little guides, all that kind of stuff. All this, every survey we can do and get publicity around it helps us sort of create the frame about the crisis of wage theft. And finally, I think we've got to both train workers and train businesses on their responsibilities. And that's a role that we can play in our churches and synagogues and mosques, in our high schools and our colleges. Why every high school, my son's just graduated from high school, so the high school years are very clear to me. But the last 3 weeks of high school, all they do, at least in Chicago, all they did was watch movies, right? All the tests are already in, they just goof off so why don't they teach worker rights? Because they're all going out in jobs where they're going to get taken advantage of all summer, right? So I actually got one of my staff to do a high school curriculum, so we're trying to get it out through the teachers union, whatever. But again, we've got to be training workers in every institution. And, I was meeting last night with folks from the North Carolina Council of Churches, and I met with the new Methodist bishop, and she said, what can we be doing? And I said, not only do we need to be training workers, but we've got to have conversations with business leaders about the importance of paying people, right? Help people grapple with doing the right thing. And make them feel guilty. I mean, our faith ought to be worth something, right? If they're not paying people, they ought to feel a little tinge of guilt on this stuff. So we've got to create in all our institutions, again, whether it's a community organization or a congregation or a school, the opportunity to train people on this stuff, because people really don't know. Workers don't know, but frankly, business folks don't know. Michael's heard this a couple times, but last week I spoke to a Rotary Club in Park Ridge, which is a very well-to-do suburb. And this guy raised his hand and he said, I'm affiliated with a bar, and we have a policy of not paying minimum wage for the first 15 hours of work. They only work for tips the first 15 hours, and then we pay minimum wage after that. And I said, well, that's illegal. And he says, well, wait, let me explain it better. and again, I said, well, what you've just described is illegal, right? And then at the end of the presentation, he comes up to me and he says, I think I didn't explain this right. He kept saying, we have a policy. Well, he just made up the policy, right? So again, I think on some level, this guy maybe wanted to do the right thing, but he thought because he had a policy and they wrote it down that it was okay, right? So again, I think there are business folks who really, there's some of them that know the law and are just flat out skirting the law, right? But there are some that think it's okay to just make up your own policy. And so we've got to help them understand that's really not okay. All right, in closing, the good news about wage theft. This is not rocket science, right? It's not even like how are we going to create 10 million new jobs in the country, which if you've got the answers, let me know, right? I mean, wage theft is not that complicated, right? It's not that hard to figure out what to do about it. And when we stop wage theft, it will put $2,600 a year in the pockets of low-wage workers. That is significant money. It's 15% of their income. We support ethical businesses when we stop wage theft. We put more money into the public coffers, and I bet North Carolina could use more money in the public coffers. And, you know, frankly, what better way to stimulate the economy than to actually make sure workers get paid, right? So ending wage theft is something we can do, and it's clearly the right thing to do.
So I am here to talk just a little bit about the North Carolina context. I have some data to show you guys, and I'll try to go through it relatively quickly so we can have time for questions and we can really talk about what it is that we can do together. So,
There you go.
thank you. So this is my bold statement, right? That documented wage theft cost North Carolina workers and their communities an estimated $13.7 million from 2010 to 2012, and there are a lot of caveats that go along with that statement. One is that it really is an estimate, and two, that it's documented. And we'll talk about both of those in just a minute, but I'll tell you how I got this number first. So the data that we have available for North Carolina is through the USDOL, which administers and enforces FLISA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the North Carolina DOL, which administers and enforces the North Carolina Wage and Hour Act. The North Carolina Bureau actually just, I think recently released some of their new data for fiscal year 2012. And there's a lot going on in this chart, but basically what it is it's giving you a 5-year look of wages due and wages collected. The tall red bars are the wages due per year, and then the orange bars are the wages collected. So I think one big takeaway from this chart is that these are significant numbers. In the last 10 years, they're between 3 million and 3.7 million. And the other takeaway is that only a portion of these wages can be collected. So this shows the numbers of cases opened and closed from the same time period. And again, on the left, the red bars are the cases opened, and on the right, the cases closed. And I wish that you guys could see these numbers, but it's approximately, it averages around 6,000 or so in the last couple of years. And one thing that I also find interesting about these numbers is that it seems to be, it's only 5 years, but there seems to be kind of a downward trend, especially in the last 3 years. So from fiscal year 2011 to fiscal year 2012, there was actually a 9% decrease compared to the previous year. So the reduction of cases being opened, according to the Bureau, was because fewer complaints have been filed. So I apologize. This breakdown by industry is actually for fiscal year 2011. I would imagine that it wouldn't be too different for fiscal year 2012, but it also really echoes what Kim was talking about, that these are the industries that we see over and over. So retail on the left there has the highest number of cases. We see restaurants, we see home health care, we see construction. I think also importantly, some of these industries are the ones with the highest growth in North Carolina, and also the highest projected growth over the next 10 years or so. So the USDOL data is a little bit more tricky, and bear with me because we're just starting to look at these numbers. But these are the total back wages that were that employers agreed to pay. And really, I think the takeaway from this chart is that, again, these are pretty significant numbers. These are for North Carolina specifically. So for instance, in 2011, you have another $3 million or so. So that's how I got that number. And it's probably not a good idea to quote it, but I think it does show that, one, we're talking about minimum wage and overtime violations. We're talking about lost paychecks in low-wage industries, but these numbers really do add up. They're really significant. And then the second takeaway, I think, from all of these is that the fact that most of the complaints are concentrated in low-wage industries is really, really significant. So I think it means those that have the most to lose are losing the most, and this is money that families desperately need, that they could be spending out in their communities, and as Kim said, it really creates an unfair disadvantages for businesses who are trying to do the right thing. So we call this the tip of the iceberg because, as I said previously, one of the most important things to remember about all of the data that I just showed you is that it's documented wage theft. So it means that a complaint has actually been filed. The study that Kim mentioned that NELP did really it was a landmark survey that was done in 2008, and it really provides a good picture of what wage theft probably actually looks like. And I won't repeat some of these same statistics, but they're so compelling, they really are. A quarter of workers were paid less than minimum wage. Overtime was really through the roof, and tipped workers were also not paid the tipped worker minimum wage. And I think when they collated all of this data, I think it was 2/3 of all of the workers sampled, so over 4,000 workers in 3 cities, experienced at least one pay-related violation in the previous week, which I think is huge. The study also asked about retaliation, and not surprisingly, found that it was a really big issue. So for those who did make a complaint to their employers, 43% experienced retaliation, and then 20% didn't even make a complaint despite having a wage violation. And of those, half were afraid of losing their jobs if they made a complaint. So I just wanted to bring up, Rob mentioned that we just recently put out a report on wage theft that profiles 10 workers in the Triangle region and tells their experiences with wage theft and the difficulties that they had with seeking redress. And really one of the big things that came out of these stories is that the obstacles to redress were huge, and they ranged from not knowing about the Wage and Hour Bureau to financial difficulties that they were referred to the Small Claims Court. But really most people talked about retaliation or the threat of retaliation. And this is just a quote from one of the participants. Carlos is actually a construction worker. He's a master carpenter. And he's been working in the field for 13 years, really kind of worked his way up. And he had multiple jobs. We asked about the last 2 years, and I think he had 4 or 5 jobs that he had in the last 2 years, and every single one of them had a wage violation. So in his most recent job, he never received his last paycheck. Before that, he wasn't paid overtime. Before that, he was only paid part of his wages. And in most of these instances, payday was always delayed, and he'd have to follow up with the employer. So, he said that he tried calling some of these employers. It usually didn't lead anywhere. Like I said, he didn't know about the Wage and Hour Bureau. He really didn't know where to turn. And then if he did get in touch with employers, they often did threaten adverse employment actions. And so he was really one of the participants that just became really disillusioned about what could be done, and almost talked about it as if this was just a way of working, which is really sad. So, and one more quote also, just to show one of the other kind of big themes that came out of the stories, was that, despite the fact that we're talking about what could be considered relatively small amounts, these amounts had huge impacts on these workers' lives. A lot of these folks were already living paycheck to paycheck. Karen, for instance, was an administrative assistant. She'd been working close to minimum wage for about 13 years. And her hours were cut from full-time to part-time, and she was really struggling. And then her company closed, and she didn't receive her last paycheck. And that was really what pushed her over the edge. And when we talked to her, she had creditors calling, she risked foreclosure, and she said, I'm 61 years old, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. So it's a really powerful story. So just in closing, just want to emphasize that the amounts that are stolen really are far from small for most workers and make a huge difference for families' economic security. And then Carol can talk about what we can do about it. Did such a good job. Thank you.
All right, well, I assume you all are here because you want to do something about this problem. And so we're hoping that you will join us in an effort to change some of the laws and regulations and enforcement practices in North Carolina so that workers can get paid the wages that they're due. We've sort of categorized these proposed changes in three groups. One is making it easier for workers to make claims. Believe it or not, many workers who aren't paid their wages don't know who they work for. And that is a very, very common thing when people call us wanting to get paid. The first question we ask is, who is your employer? And oftentimes they have no idea. And it's not just a day laborer problem where somebody's working for different. Providing notice to workers at the time that they're hired about whether they're going to be categorized as an independent contractor or an employee would also be a critical piece of information. I spoke on the phone just a couple weeks ago with a physician's assistant who was hired by a medical practice, had a long history of being a physician's assistant, and it wasn't until after she started work that she realized that they were going to pay her as an independent contractor. Maybe she wouldn't have taken that job if she had known that that was the way it was set up. So providing that notice would be important. And then if workers lose their jobs or quit their jobs and they go to apply for unemployment, oftentimes that's when they realize that they've been misclassified and that they're not entitled to unemployment benefits. Providing some clear notice to workers of what it means if the reason their claim is denied is because they were classified as an independent contractor would help them know whether they have the grounds to contest that claim and actually get benefits. To create better remedies for workers who have had wages stolen from them, we could increase the amount that workers can get back. Right now, you're entitled to up to twice the wages owed if you make a claim. And attorney's fees are discretionary. The judge can decide whether or not to award those, and it makes it really hard for workers to find lawyers who will take these cases. So those would be positive changes that could make a real difference for workers having redress. Providing a way for workers to be paid promptly when their employment ends instead of having to wait till the next payday. That's really important for workers in certain industries like farm work, where they're going to move on. And we have often gotten calls from workers who are in another state who are trying to collect money that they earned back in North Carolina. It's really hard to do when you're out of state. So providing some kind of quick payment when employment ends would make a real difference for people. Increasing civil penalties and creating criminal penalties for non-payment of wages or underpayment of wages would also be a deterrent for employers. And giving workers a real meaningful way to make a lien against their employer's property if they're not paid. That's been a very effective remedy in other parts of the country. It's something that we could do here in North Carolina. Kim talked some about payroll fraud, where workers are classified as independent contractors. A real step in the right direction would be creating a presumption that people are in fact employees and the employer would have to prove otherwise. That would make a significant difference to people like that physician's assistant who had called me. And then giving people who've been wrongly classified the ability to sue and to get some of those benefits that they were entitled to get that overtime pay. They can sue for overtime pay now, but to get the other types of benefits that they would have gotten if they had been properly classified would be a real step in the right direction. And then connected to all of this is workers who are classified as independent contractors and not covered by workers' comp, as you all learned from the News and Observer series, oftentimes don't have access to workers' comp at all. And if the employer has no ability to pay for the injury that worker has suffered, those workers have nothing. And so creating some kind of a fund to help those workers to be able to collect something in the event that their employer can't provide those benefits would be helpful. And then we need to strengthen enforcement. Our Wage and Hour Bureau has limited resources. Being able to give them the money so that they can do effective outreach to let workers know about their rights and how to make a claim, so that they can do these affirmative investigations that we're proposing that they do, where they can do sweeps of problem industries, unannounced audits, to really have a proactive campaign that will deter employers and collect money for workers that requires more resources. And then I think Kim also mentioned this ability of third-party complaints, that in some states worker centers and other groups can make complaints for workers who are afraid to speak up themselves. That would be helpful. It would also allowing the Wage and Hour Bureau to investigate the entire work site when one worker makes a complaint would be a way of really not just looking at these things as isolated incidents, but getting after industry-wide problems. And then another thing that was highlighted in the News and Observer series recently was this problem with agencies being able to communicate, both because of long practice and technological difficulties with sharing information. So trying to resolve those problems would allow, when a worker has been determined from the unemployment office to qualify for unemployment benefits, they were a worker, they were not an independent contractor, share that information with the Industrial Commission so that they can make sure that employer starts providing workers' comp. Share that with the Department of Labor so that they can see if those workers have been paid overtime. And then finally, giving the Department of Labor the ability to order employers to stop their production that they're involved in if they're not paying their workers correctly is a powerful tool that could be used to really make a difference. Entering into this memorandum of understanding that the U.S. Department of Labor has set up that allows some of this information sharing between federal agencies and the State Department of Labor around employer classification would also be helpful. So we hope that you all will join us in this effort to change our law and to change enforcement. And we've got more information on the back tables about that. And look for us in the next legislative session.
No, time is short. Time is short, and we're keeping you late. We're going to very quickly, 2 minutes, I'm going to go through some new poll results that I think will give us some cause for optimism in this debate. We did a poll this week, actually, of registered voters in North Carolina about some of these issues, and we've just got a handful of questions. I'm just going to very quickly go through them for you. The series in the News and Observer about workers' compensation, the fact that workers are not being provided with it, that there are these ghost insurance policies out there. We asked her, would you support tougher laws and law enforcement in this area? And you can get all the specific questions at our website this afternoon. I've sort of distilled down the questions, but some information was provided to people so they knew what we were talking about. And as you can see, overwhelming support for requiring tougher laws and law enforcement in this area, 72% to 17%. We asked about the fact that we have children working in the fields still in this state, and the fact that in agriculture, children are not offered the same protections that they are offered in other industries. And again, 65 to 17 people think it's a no-brainer that we need to have those same sorts of protections. And on the question of wage theft, the subject of today's event, would you support tougher laws and enforcement to require employers to pay employees all they are owed? 81 to 14%. I think this validates our notion that everybody has experienced this at one time or another. And the same thing on the misclassification employees. Would you support a law that requires employers to tell all workers in writing whether they are employees or contractors? 78%, only 13% opposed. I'm not sure who those 13% are. Then we got into Sabine, who I didn't get properly introduced, who's a policy analyst at the Justice Center's Workers' Rights Project. Has been doing research and advocacy around the issue of paid family and medical leave. And we asked, should North Carolina adopt a paid family and medical leave insurance program, as has been done in a couple of other states? 62 to 26 like the idea. Would you support a model in which paid leave program is funded through withholdings from payroll taxes? We sort of described how that would work. Again, very significant majority in favor of. And then we asked one last question on this topic. What if we made employers pay part of it? And it actually did reduce the support for it, but was still 2 to 1 in favor. So there's still broad support. People like the idea of paid family and medical leave insurance. They like the idea of stronger enforcement of worker protection laws in the state. So I think this should give us We know for a fact that the politics are difficult right now in North Carolina, but as Kim has indicated, these kinds of things can get done. They can get done in very conservative states once people understand the facts, and we know that the majority of registered voters are behind us. I know time is very short, and it's 20 after 1. Some people may have to leave, but do you have a question for Kim, or for Carol, or Sabina, or any of the polling information? We'd be happy to take a couple minutes to answer questions. And yes, ma'am. Right.
Yeah, Minister Schofield from the Wake County Democratic Party. Okay, there is a very good resource. His name is John Brooks, and he's currently running for Labor Commissioner. And so I don't know who has his contact information, but because it's on the web. But in any event, we haven't spoken about public workers and public labor, and I was just wondering if the denial of collective bargaining, as has happened in Wisconsin, is a version of wage theft.
Who wants to take that one? Well, I think you've hit on a lot of important topics there. I think one can certainly make the argument. I mean, Kim has made the argument that the demise of organized labor and the decline in the percentage of people who are organized in the workforce is a trick. You can draw a line between that and poor treatment of workers in the workforce. I mean, you were making that argument. I don't think anybody can deny it. So, Representative Bryant.
I just had a question about whether there are really any issues about wage theft in the government sector. You didn't mention it. Did you mention it at all?
No, but yes.
Can you say
There are a number of places where I've heard stories about workers in schools, again, not getting paid overtime, working below minimum wage, actually in some cafeterias in some places. There's a problem with school bus drivers, all sorts of cheating of wages for school bus drivers around the country, right? Durham and First Student and, all the major bus companies have had problems in that area. So again, those are all public sector workers. There's also a problem in public sector workers that do nursing homes, child care. Those are both fields where people do a lot of off-the-clock work. They work through their lunch hour, they're not paid for it. Again, so especially in states where you don't have collective bargaining, yes, public sector is again, I don't think public sector is as bad as the private sector, but especially in the low-wage arenas, it's a problem. Having a collective voice matters.
I think as Representative Bryant is probably aware, the Justice Center has been involved with litigation against the state of North Carolina involving public employees who have been at times classified as temporary employees for 11 months of the year and then rehired. I mean, this is a long-standing tradition, particularly in the Department of Transportation. And Tom from the State Employees Association might want to say something.
I'm Tom Harris. I'm General Counsel of the State Employees Association, which represents 55,000 state employees and retirees. And I was also having to work with Mike at the Department of Labor for a number of years. And one thing that you should be aware of is that the state wage and hour law, except for minimum wage, exempts the state employees from all other aspects of the Wage and Hour Act.
Oh, great.
So there is no enforcement of overtime, for example, by the state. Now, the federal government would cover that. There's also no enforcement of wage payment by the state for state employees. I am the recipient of a number of complaints, being the position I'm in. Most of the complaints within the last several years have been surrounding the new payroll system that the state set up called Beacon, which has shorted people. We have been helping people get those problems corrected when they report to us and working with the system to correct those. But that's most of what we've heard. I also deal with a number of people in various industries, such as the prisons, that deal with overtime laws to make sure they're being enforced correctly.
Maybe.
Kim, just on behalf of the AFL-CIO, I just want to say how thankful we are that you are working so hard nationally to bring attention not only to wage theft, but to the issue of worker justice more broadly. And really appreciate you coming to North Carolina and devoting a number of days to do events, and wanted to let people know that she's also doing 2 events at Duke Divinity School. There's a talk this evening at 6:30, have flyers, and then a lunch tomorrow at 12:30 to really strategize about building a broader movement for worker justice. So I encourage all of you to come out to these events because we have a long way to go for worker justice in this state. And a lot of it is because we are the least unionized state in the country. And I've joked that most Democrats and even some progressives in this state treat union like it's a bad word. They say it only in certain company or in times of great duress, and that's got to change. If we're going to talk about worker justice, we have got to talk about unions and the right to organize and collectively bargain. And I really appreciated you talking about the role of unions and fighting back, not just on wage theft, but on all these issues. So I ask all of you, come to these events and talk loudly and proudly in support of unions.
I think we've probably used up as much of your day as we fairly can. So thank you very much for coming. I know that Kim will be around, as will Carol and Sabine, if you have questions. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time. Stay tuned for the next event. Yeah.